Hey Ingmar, so such a pleasure to see you again. As
Likewise.
yeah. So what we thought we might do today for our audience is look at the life of our beloved teacher, master, example, saint that in the West is known as Jesus. In the East he's known as Issa or Yeshua or Yesu or Yusasuf. There's many different names at different times. And yeah, but there's so much more to this story than we actually understand today. Because, what we know today comes from a single tradition, the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church to be specific. And then going through all these different councils where they redacted a number of the books that were part of the Bible, New Testament, until it became a very skimpy, you know, um, version of the complexity and breadth and beauty of the whole story. So what we could do today, I guess, is just like look at some of the different pieces coming from the Essene tradition, the Gnostic tradition, the Kashmiri tradition, the Jain tradition, the Tibetan tradition, the Chinese tradition, because this is a story that wasn't located in just one area of the world. It was a global um, story. So, so where shall we begin?
Yeah.
What's
Yeah, I think it's a really good idea because
mm,
whenever since I was a child, I was always interested in mysticism and the
mm,
secrets. And when I was young, I was asking how were
mm,
pyramids built, why were they built, and I wanted to find
right?
out everything. So I read a lot, and during the years, I really realized that reading completely different, studying completely different traditions, there was this red thread going through it. Like in the Indian system, they talked about chakras, and then I was learning about the Keros in the Andes and the Pacos, the priests there, and they were talking about bubbles instead of auras, and they had belts instead of chakras.
Mm,
And but there was so much overlap, a little bit different, but at the same time, a lot of similarities. So
right.
I
Yeah.
think I think this is the way for us to find truth in what is written and what is
Mm,
transferred orally as well. And I think it's a good idea because what you said, when Christianity uh, composed or compiled the Bible as we know it, they made a choice from different gospels.
mm,
Uh,
right.
Quite some gospels didn't even make it in the Bible. One of them being the
Yeah.
Gospel of
Yeah. And we
Thomas, and the other being the Gospel of Judas.
Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Mary.
Exactly. And I mean, so much knowledge already is lost as well because these Gospels, they were, you probably know the story, they were found in the desert by this man who dug up this clay pot, and all these scrolls were in there with his
Mm,
gospels, and he brought them home thinking, he just didn't know what it was. And his mother burned, I think, almost 80% of it in the stove to heat the house.
mm, ugh,
And so much of it is lost, and it's in a sense it's so frustrating, but also a blessing that we still have some of those
right.
texts. And I think the same
Yeah.
is with the Essenes,
With
right?
the
Um,
with the Essene and with the Eastern Gospels.
the
So
Dead Sea
in
Scrolls.
so in Egypt and Israel, we have the Nag Hammadi and the Qumran texts, which are actually, they're simply collections. They're not anything new. They're the original writings that were hermetically sealed in these clay jars in the dry desert heat.
Yeah.
In the East, maybe we could start with this because there's a tradition of Christian, I won't say Christian, but Christian literature going back to before the four synoptic gospels were written. So this goes back to maybe 40 AD, 50 AD, 60 AD. And a couple of the major Gospels were called the Acts of Issa and the Acts of Thomas. Not the Gospel of Thomas, Acts of Thomas. And this goes back to St. Thomas, who, as we spoke about last time, was the brother, the twin brother of Issa. And then there were a whole number of manuscripts that were also carried by the Buddhists, the Mahayana Buddhists, by the Tibetans, by different branches of the Hindu tradition, the old Vedic tradition, the Kashmiri tradition, the Chinese, the Japanese. So they all had their part to play. And then we talked about the Essene Gospels, the Gospel of Peace, and others. And interestingly, they say that the Essenes, or at least one stream of the Essenes, originated back in India with the time of Emperor Ashoka. So the story goes that Ashoka was a major conqueror around, I think it was shortly after the Buddha, and pretty ruthless, and all he cared for was slaughtering and building his empire, until he had a epiphany where he saw through all the brutality and the uselessness of this, and then he became a Buddhist and followed the Buddha. And he was so passionate about the prospect of peace then at this point, and a true coming together of nations and cultures and traditions, that then he sent out missionaries to different parts of the world. So up into China, into Japan, down into Sri Lanka, and then across to the east, out to the west. And this group, this brotherhood of monks, were connected somehow with the Essene. So the Essenes were an outgrowth of the Buddhist tradition. And you can still see in their tradition many of the same parables, the same teachings, the same source writings, the same admonitions to go out 2 by 2. And like Jesus himself said, he sent disciples out 2 by 2, living very simple lives, barefoot and carrying just what they could wear, and trusting God to provide, which was basically the tradition of the Eastern monks and the sadhus throughout India and Japan. So the Buddhists and the Essenes had that in common. And apparently, after Issa and his family migrated to Egypt, so this was when they were threatened by Herod, King Herod, who wanted to basically wipe out the possible competitor for his throne. Who, and we can get into that story, because this is interesting. Why did they consider that Jesus would be a political threat, if not for certain other factors which people don't recognize today? So then during that time, so between the ages of around 2 till about 12, so that's a 10-year chunk of time, his family, Issa and his family, were with the Essenes, learning from the Essenes, growing up in the monasteries in the Qumran, many of
Which
the
I think
others.
is also about, because I think for the Essenes, you had a 1-year initiation period, and then after that, 2 years, and then 7 years that you had to go through these teachings, right? So that would be 10 years in total.
So he must have started pretty early. Yeah.
Did
And
you
the
find out
Essenes,
anything about his age and the timeline? Because of course there's different stories about the timeline and Jesus's life, and I know that there's somebody who went to a Buddhist monastery and actually was shown these scrolls that were talking about Issa, about Jesus. And of course,
Right.
when they went back to check, the abbot said, "Well, I don't know. I never heard about this." And
Yeah.
but
Yeah, depending on who is asking.
exactly,
So yeah.
exactly.
So let's go through a very quick chronology, and then we can come back into different
Yeah, I
pieces
think
of
that
this.
would be interesting because I even think that Buddhism originally uh, came from Kashmir Shaivism, even.
There were parallel lines.
Yeah,
Yes, yes.
yeah.
So actually, let's go back even further. So around 1500 BC, before Buddhism, the lost tribes, the so-called lost tribes, these were 10 of the 12 Israeli tribes who got displaced. And there were all kinds of wars happening during that time. And the other two tribes, I think it was the tribe of David and Benjamin, perhaps, they allied with the Assyrians to overthrow the other tribes who had been located north of the Jordan River. So when they were dislocated, they were basically moved out to Afghanistan and then into Kashmir
Mm,
wholesale. So this was a huge mass migration of these so-called lost tribes.
mm,
And then they intermarried with the local tribes, the tribesmen in Afghanistan and in Kashmir who were sourced from the Caucasus Mountains. So still in Kashmir, you'll see these people with, and Afghanistan, um, people with green eyes, aquiline noses, and fair skin, blue eyes, green eyes, you know, very strange for a Semitic people.
yeah,
So what
indeed.
was happening is that, there were all these intermarrying lineages, and the lineage that Siddhartha came from, who became the Buddha, and the lineage that Jesus came from, or Issa, were very parallel to each other. They had similar sources. Both of them had Jewish as well as Tracharya and Sakya Muni um, genetics. So it was quite interesting because uh, the Buddha came along about 500 years BC, and he predicted, at least there was an oracle, a prophecy, that 500 years after his death, there would be another bodhisattva emerging. And nobody, so as the story goes with any of these reincarnations, often what happens is that when an old incarnation is ready to depart the physical body, they'll give hints of what their next incarnation will look like, where they will come from. And so in this case, guess why the so-called wise men went out looking for Issa in Palestine? Because that's what they were told.
Mm,
And part of the function, part of the reason that he was born in Palestine rather than in Kashmir was because his role, his task, was to bring all the tribes together, unite the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, but also perhaps to bring all the different spiritual traditions that existed at that time together. So, so that's one reason I think he had to travel so much, explore so many different traditions, learn from so many different teachers, and then through his own experiences and integration, grow into what he became, calling himself, this, or at least calling himself at one with the source. So it
mm,
was interpreted as the only Son of God, which he never actually meant. But there's a title in Persia, Son of God, which actually means someone who's enlightened. So it's not like it's someone special or unique. Um, or came from some source that's different from the rest of us. But as an example, as a teacher, as someone who could show the way, one one translation of his name, Yusasif, which is a name used or given to Issa in India, was the shower, the way shower. So I like that because, as a way shower, it's no one who puts themselves above or below. It's like, okay, I've traveled this path. I know some of the experiences that are possible. I can show you the way. I can show you the way so you can then pass that along to others and show them the way.
Yeah, and I think this is a very important point because, almost everybody knows the words of Christ as they were said in the Bible. I am the Father is within me, and also only through me you'll reach the kingdom of heavens. And if you look at that in the light of he was the only son, then it would mean the only way to go to heaven is through this person, Jesus Christ, that once lived, and according some people never died and still lives, and according to other people will return, which is our only salvation, our only way to reach this, which is, I think, in a sense, a very limiting and very debilitating almost train of thoughts and idea, because it's if we realize that what Christ meant is, I am the Father, or I am God, this is my true nature, and this is your true nature, and this is everybody's true nature. And by self-realization, by realizing your true nature, yourself, remembering it, you will enter this kingdom of heaven, which is within you.
Right.
Then
right.
it becomes a whole different story. And then all of a sudden you start to see the overlap with Kashmir Shaivism and the Essenes and all these other religions. Then all of a sudden this boundary falls away that Christianity created.
So when he says I am the way, it's not I individual self, but the I am within me and the I am within you. And the I am is just the Hebrew translation of something that the Vedic rishis understood. It's simply the source that is inseparable from anything in creation. So anything within creation, anything outside of creation is the one unified force field that we can call God, the divine, or I am. And the reason it's stated as I am is simply because it's a felt presence. One way to experience it is simply divine presence. There's no words that are necessary. There's no qualities necessary. There's simply the presence that moves through all things, that connects all things, that is all things simultaneously. And once you're connected with this source field, nothing is outside of you. Nothing is outside of you, in terms of relationship or form. Nothing is outside of you in terms of capabilities and potential.
I love how you say simply, because once this is realized, once this I am is experienced and realized, then it is apparent that it is that simple. But to actually realize it seems almost impossible until you actually have this realization.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's the key. And what has happened is that so much of truth has become dogma. And when it becomes dogma, it becomes mentalized. And when it becomes mentalized, then there's all these steps to follow.
Yes.
Whereas it's really what we need to unfollow, take back, and return to source, which is so simple. And that's one reason children, before they become indoctrinated, they live in that source field. They're so open to everything around them. They see with new eyes, with fresh eyes, each moment of the day. And we've forgotten that, or we've unlearned that because of our mentalization. And so what Issa and these other teachers are calling us to is to let go of the mentalization and just recognize the truth. That's what's so simple.
Yeah.
And I think when you're with Kashmir Shaivism, it is very simple, and we could go into this. Same with the Gnostics, same with the Cathars and the Essenes. It's like truth is simple. It has to be simple. We make it complicated because we don't understand. So we're trying to fit it
It
into our
is,
little
and I
mental
find it
boxes.
interesting to. I think it's good to go into this because, when I myself had this realization of this I amness, this true nature, and just to be clear, this is not an intellectual understanding. Of course, it also is an intellectual understanding, but it's also an experiential part of it that is for some reason very important when you have this realization, because I think when you have this experiential realization, that's when knowledge gets not replaced but gets there comes wisdom. And I think the difference between knowledge and wisdom is that when you read a Gnostic text and you had this realization, you immediately know what they're talking about. It's like you said, it's simple. It's you see the truth in the Gospels. When you read a sutra, even if it's a translation and even if it's a wrong translation, somehow you can read through it and you can see, okay, this is the truth of it. You can also see where people misinterpret it, where they go wrong and why they go wrong, why they misinterpret it, whether it's somebody misinterpreting the gospel or mistranslating Sanskrit or whatever scroll it is or text it is. I think we touched it a little bit last time. I'm not sure if we recorded it, but for example, in non-duality and also in Gnosticism, you see this. People talk about we have creation as we experience it is illusionary in nature because it's a reflection of the divine. It's almost like looking at ourselves in a mirror, and we are not looking at a real person in a mirror. No, we're looking at a reflection. It's an illusion, but the conclusion that people say, then it's not real. It doesn't exist. And there
It's a
is where
reflection of the real, but it has a reality, but it's a reality that's lent.
yeah.
So the reality that we experience here in this body, in this on this planet, is a reflection of something that is transcendental, but is equally real. So that's a difference between Kashmir Shaivism and some of the other Advaitic traditions, where the Advaitic traditions would say the reflection isn't real, whereas Kashmir Shaivism would say, yes, it's real because everything is real. It's just that once we recognize it as a reflection, then we can look beyond. Instead of pointing at the finger, you point to the moon or that which the finger is pointing towards.
Yeah.
And you can experience this in a daily way. So that's what makes it simple. It makes you're connecting with the essence of truth.
Yes.
And then you see it in everything.
Exactly.
When you're relating to a person, you're relating to the essence within that person because it's the same essence that I carry inside myself.
Yes, and then it also doesn't matter if somebody talks about God or Shiva or meta consciousness or the source or the divine light, because
Right.
you recognize that it's the same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So
All right. So,
take us to
hmm.
Kashmir and to the
Okay, so let's continue the chronology. So, all right, so Issa's parents, or Jesus's parents, I'll call him Issa for now, for the purpose of this discussion, because if I'm looking at the Eastern version, he was known as Issa. So his parents were actually from the ruling family in Kashmir, in the kingdom of what was known as Kash, which later became the Kashmir. So it was centered around Srinagar. His father was named Pravesana, and his mother was known as Amritananda, something of that sort. And then they were told before their child was born that there was a prophecy. And they were told to, in response to this prophecy, that they needed to go into Palestine, where the remaining tribes of Jews had been settled. So this was during the time of King Herod and the governor Pontius Pilate, and it was all part of the Roman Empire. There were all these local intrigues and fights going on. So this was a very, very warlike tradition and very dualistic tradition. So, okay, so they migrated over. Back in those days, it took about 3 or 4 months. So the person that we now know as Maryam or Mary, Jesus's mother, was pregnant, probably early pregnancy. And I'm not going to go into virgin birth and such, because that's another whole story. But they migrated. They arrived in Bethlehem. They needed to be registered because they were new to that area. So they didn't have a place when this big census was going on. They didn't have a home town that they could point to. So, okay, someone gave them a stable. Okay, that's your home. So that's your address. All right, so here's Issa, born in the stable, as the Western stories go. But he was not the only child. He was a twin. And this is part of an early church tradition that got covered up later. There's still paintings in many of the churches, and the Coptic churches specifically in Egypt, that show Mother Mary holding twins in her arms. And even in the Greek tradition, in the New Testament, Thomas is known as the twin. Didymus is the Greek translation. So, it was known back then. So then what happened is that because he was a tulku, which is the Tibetan term for incarnation, an incarnation of a revered lama, the oracles came looking for him. They brought certain objects to test him, and both of them, in fact. So just like behind you on the table, there's those bowls, the singing bowls. Same thing, they would bring these bowls, they'd bring other objects, bracelets, different things, beads that were used by the old Lama. So in this case, it would have been Siddhartha, the Buddha. And those lamas then brought those relics and to see what the response would be from these two boys, the two twins. And apparently, okay, so one of them passed and was then declared to be the Bodhisattva or the Maitreya, which later in the Hebrew tradition became the Messiah or the Messiah. So there's similarities even in the linguistic.
Maybe later we can also go in a little bit on what is a bodhisattva and what is a bodhicitta, for example, because not everybody might know the difference. So,
well, this is a good time.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Okay.
So what's the difference? And how would you make the difference?
Well, in Gnosticism, they say a bodhisattva is somebody who is truly realized and who has true mastership over our animalistic nature, who is truly, as they would say, free of sin, an enlightened being. And a bodhicitta is somebody who had this glimpse, who had this realization, but somehow fell back into the earthy realm and can talk about it, can share the experience, can teach about it, but has not ended this cycle of reincarnation and
interesting.
is basically still connected to the earthy realm, so to say.
Yeah, and in the Hindu tradition, they have a similar concept, the difference between an avatar and a vibhuti. So an avatar is one who's who fully reflects the next potential of divinity as it's applied to our human species and evolution. So, there's been many avatars, including Issa. So, and each avatar brings something fresh to that particular culture and to the development of the human race in that moment.
Yeah.
And then a vibhuti is someone who comes in with a piece of novelty that's needed at the time, but not necessarily spiritual. So someone like Nikola Tesla, someone like Ramanuja, the mathematician.
Yeah.
Many of these inventors, many of these geniuses, people like Leonardo da Vinci, they were vibhutis. They were able to synthesize things in a new way, to create a new paradigm that would then uplift all of humanity. But the difference with an avatar, or in this case, a bodhisattva, would be that they were like bringing a new potential for the next human species to follow. So, the Rudolf Steiner talks about different root races. Yeah. So at each juncture, whenever a new root race is born, there's an avatar that steps in to create the template for what this could look like.
Yes.
Maybe a Manu, as some call it.
Yeah, I think he even says that the Buddha was the first who spoke of I am and I amness. And Rudolf Steiner said the Buddha basically incarnated the sense of I amness, and from that moment on, everybody on the planet, or maybe even beyond the planet, embodies this I amness, because he incarnated it not only in his own body but for everybody.
Right. Yeah, so the potential, I think there's been many different stages. Sri Aurobindo talks about the movement from animalistic, where we're determined by our instincts, like animals. Nothing, it's not a hierarchy. Then the next phase was the development of the mind. But because the mind wasn't able to fully harmonize with the instinct, it became separate. And that's when our experience of duality came in. We separated ourselves from the web of life. Yeah. The next phase after that is the unification of instinct with mind into this realm of intuition. And the intuition is a direct experience of truth. So if I look at you, Ingmar, from my intuitive faculties, I am you. I'm experiencing you from inside of yourself.
Yes.
So I'm not seeing you with the qualities that I'm interpreting through the mind. I'm experiencing you as you are. And if you're lost in some way from the direct sense perception of who you are, then in my ability to see you in essence, I can awaken that in you. And I think this is what all these avatars were capable of doing. They're capable
This
of.
is interesting. This is how when I pray for healing for somebody else, when I'm in my work,
Right.
when I'm healing, I pray to this divinity in me, knowing that it's the same divinity in the other person, and that this divinity in the other person, which seems separate from me, which isn't, is actually the consciousness that facilitates the healing.
Yeah, so let's get back to the timeline. So here we have these two twins, Issa and Thomas, being tested by these Tibetan oracles. And apparently Issa must have passed. And the report went back. So from that point on, he became a focal point. So they had their ways of keeping watch over these tulkus, not necessarily physical. They could tune in. They were able to be multidimensional in their way of following someone's development and growth and journeys. So soon after that, remember the decree from King Herod, because he felt the threat to his political rulership. The decree that every child less than 2 years old was to be killed. And so that's the point. So he must have been below or less than 2 years old at that point. So at that point, the family fled to Egypt, most likely to one of the Essene monasteries, either Qumran or to, what's the other one? Alexandria. There were 2 or 3 major ones. And they were given everything they would need. So when the oracles or the wise men came bearing gifts, one of the gifts was enough gold, enough wealth to be able to support them, the whole family. So they did not have to, live in deprivation. So this was the time, and because the Essenes were basically very much of a community consciousness, it was not personal wealth. It went to support the entire Essene community. So I would say between the time of around 2 to the time of around 12, the family lived in Alexandria, in Qumran, different parts of Egypt, studying. Issa must have studied with some of the Essene teachers, probably initiated in a number of Essene practices. And the Essene tradition is very much about healing, working with the elemental qualities of nature, the sun, the air, the water, also mud for, mud and herbs, and the ability to tune into something that was inside of yourself that was identical with the world around. So that sense of deep connection with natural elements inside and natural elements outside imparted those elemental qualities with the spiritual signature. So then, for instance, if you're using mud, remember that story of Jesus placing mud on this woman's eyes who was blind, and she was healed, because there's a spiritual quality to these elemental forces that made things much more powerful. I mean, this was the transcendence of purely physical healing with metaphysical healing. So this was part of his early education. Then at around the age of 12, remember, he was talking with priests in the temple who were amazed at his precociousness, which obviously came from his time with the Essenes, plus his own natural proclivity to these unified energies. So then around the age of 12, after this experience, is nothing in the Western Bible. between age of 12 and 30. There's absolutely nothing.
It disappears.
Yeah. So all it says is he grew in stature and in wisdom, but how, where? And so that's where this other story comes in. So where was he between those years? So, there's many stories of how he passed through Persia. He was taken in by the by the ruling classes, by the priests, and taught all these different traditions, astrology, and other forms of healing, and the Zoroastrian tradition, the use of fire to purify, internal fire. Then across through Afghanistan into India, through the monasteries of Takshila, which was one of the major monasteries of that time. It was a teaching school where many of the royals from across the world would come and study with the rishis. So he spent some time there. His uncle was the ruler of Takshila, that region, Gonda Forest. And he finds, that if he's somewhere in historical literature, along with his father, who we today know in the Western Bible as Joseph. In Kashmir, he was known as Parvasana. So he spent some time with the monasteries in Takshila, then made his way down, often accompanied or sent, because he wasn't just traveling by himself. He was guided by the monks in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. He had another teacher that I'll come to later. But he traveled all through the Malabar coast amongst the Jewish tribes there, across to Sri Lanka, where the Mahayana Buddhists were, then up to Jagannath Puri, where there's an ancient temple of Vedic wisdom. He spent several years there. That's where he actually met Mary Magdalene, who was his teacher in some ways as a tantrika. So her name was Marie from the kingdom of Magadha, which later translated to Mary Magdalena. So this is according to the Acts of Issa from the early Christian Marthoma Church on the Malabar coast. And then from there up to Kapilavastu. Then at one point on his way to Kashmir, because by then his parents had moved back to Kashmir, awaiting his return, he met his guru, his primary teacher. And he was from the Nath lineage, which was a lineage of immortals, starting with Gorakhnath and many others. And his name was Chetannath. And Chetannath was given the responsibility of following the trials and life experiences of Issa, from the very moment he was born. So he was able to tune in on an inner level to follow his path, to support and protect him along the way. And finally, here he is meeting him in person. And this is beautifully described. It's a cave across from a double waterfall. Next to the stream running by, there's neighboring villages where he would often go to just be available to the villagers.
But where was it described, Kiara?
I have a list of writings. I think it's the Nath. There's some Nath literature, Nath Namavali something, or maybe just Nath Namavali. It's the history of the Nath tradition, the Nath lineage. And the Nath lineage, I think, were some of the early precursors for Kashmir Shaivism. So back then, the word Kashmir Shaivism wasn't used. In fact, Kashmir Shaivism is a very modern term. Back then, they maybe talked about Shiva and Shakti. So it was Shaivism in the sense that Shiva and Shakti were the two polarities of divinity. So Shiva being the still point within all things, and Shakti being the dynamic movement that emits into time and space to manifest as creation. You know, all these different layers and dimensions of creation. But they're inseparable. So within Shakti, there's Shiva. Without Shiva, there's no Shakti. So they're inseparably a part of each other, Father, Mother, God, if you want to translate it that way. So the Nath lineage was about recognizing the divinity within humanity, recognizing spirit within matter, and to transform the physical body into a light body. So in the later Tibetan tradition, also in the Bon tradition of in Tibet, there was this whole effort to create the rainbow body. So and
You
even
see this
today
as well in Gnosticism and in Gnostic teachings, although it's not seen as replacing our physical body with a luminous body, so to say, but it's almost like we develop this light body within ourselves, within our awareness, and it becomes like these sheets that we talk about, these koshas.
Right. Yeah, the five koshas and the
Yeah.
and even in
Which
Egyptian.
also means that when people talk about their auras, for example, or their energy field, that it doesn't mean that everybody has this fully developed light body. You have to work for it. You have to
work on it. Exactly. So that's okay. Let's talk about this a bit. We'll take a quick diversion. So, you know, when people talk about the aura, it's a very generic term. You know, what does that mean? In the Hindu tradition, they talk about the five bodies, the five koshas. In the Egyptian tradition, the sheets. Egyptian tradition, very similar. In the Inca tradition, also very similar. But what these represent, the physical body is obvious, known as the food body. Then you have the prana body. Prana is life force, energy, breath, which very closely supports and energizes the physical body. Without the prana body or the etheric body, the physical body would collapse.
Yes.
So when you stop breathing, or when you die to the physical body, the prana body basically lifts away from the physical body along with the mental and emotional bodies, and they travel on with a new focus of consciousness, independent of the physical body, but maintaining that sense of self and personality that doesn't die, which then starts to move through dimensions to eventually rejoin with the fifth body or the causal body known as the Anandamaya Kosha or the bliss body. Yeah. So this was the body that the Nath yogis were developing. So as part of the transition to the rainbow body, it was the unification of these four lower bodies with this fifth body. And when that could be accomplished, and it took time, it was, you know, sometimes lifetimes. But once that was accomplished, like you're suggesting, you know, this was then a new layer of the aura that was quite extensive. And through the use of this aura, this fifth body, the Anandamaya Kosha, miracles were possible.
Which would make somebody a bodhisattva.
Yeah, exactly. And this is what Jesus was trying to teach his disciples.
Yes.
You know, so what does he mean by going out and heal the sick? It wasn't just the Essene guidelines, but it was also the Nath technologies for working with the unified bodies, the light bodies. And then through that, you create a hole in space and time through which miracles are possible. So you don't, so it doesn't require time in order to heal. It doesn't require space. You can do it through distance. And you can teleport yourself from place to place and time to time. You can travel to distant dimensions and star systems. So, in the Nath tradition, this was common. In the Tibetan yogic tradition, this was common. In the Inca tradition, the Egyptian tradition, this was accepted.
Yeah.
And many of these practices, like, you could speak about the Gnostic tradition or the Egyptian tradition, exactly the same thing in different words, different terms. Yeah, so this was his primary teacher then, Chaitanya. So from that point on, he became a major influence in his life. So while he was still in India during those years, he would go back and forth. From there, he would go to Kashmir, where his parents were. Like I said earlier, his parents were the rulers. His father was the actual prince or king, whatever they called it, of that particular locale. There were many, many different kingdoms in Kashmir and Afghanistan. So it wasn't like today, one king of Kashmir. It was different kingdoms of fiefdoms, princeships. So then he was also taught the art of statesmanship because he was a successor of that throne. So that's where the political aspect comes in. He wasn't just a spiritual teacher. He was also someone who was trained to literally unite the tribes, to literally govern people in a good way. Because back then, it was part of the, if you were given, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, if you're given rulership, there's a word that I can't remember.
Yeah,
if
the
you're given,
succession of
yeah, so then you had to, it was never for your own benefit. It was always in service to your people. And I can't find a single world government today that lives by that rule. It's all, what can I get out of this? Fill up, my own bank account or whatever. So it was recognized back then that if you are a king, you are in service to the people, or you don't remain in that position for very long. And so he would go back and forth between Kashmir, his kingdom, where his father still, he would spend time there and then he would travel out. His father was a merchant also, because back then, kings were also the ambassadors. So in other words, they would be sent out, they would go out to make trade agreements to different parts of the world. So he would travel often into Egypt, into England, into France, into different parts of Europe, Turkey, which is why there's still those connections in that lineage. And so Issa was then assigned to learn, to be an apprentice to the arts of statesmanship and also the arts of spiritual awareness and building the light body. That was his preparation for the ministry in Palestine. So then he was sent back, and there was a whole ceremony where all the different lineage, the Nath yogi lineage came and, kind of created a vehicle through that would protect him, like an etheric vehicle that could protect him and guide him on his journey back west. So he arrived back and he was probably around 30. And that's what we know today as his ministry in the Western churches.
Yeah.
So that led to, the story of his ministry, the Sermon on the Mount, the parables, the teachings, eventually the crucifixion, and some would say the resurrection, which, according to alternative theories, wasn't actually a resurrection as such, but a resuscitation. The resuscitation is different in that the person isn't physically dead, maybe close to death, but not. And we could go into the story because this is
There's
really
actually a
fascinating.
branch within the Gnostic teachings where they say that Christ, when he was on the cross, he went in, I think, in Nirvapala Samadhi. He went in a very deep trance where he just disappeared. He seemed
Right.
dead, and
Right.
which is a state of samadhi, which is very profound and very deep. And
Mm.
he just came back from this meditation, and he got off the cross and he traveled, continued with his life.
Yeah.
Others say that the whole crucifixion was symbolic, that it never happened.
That too.
Um, but it's interesting because I do think there's a lot of symbolism within the cross. I also think I would like to know how what your view is on the resurrection of the cross with the bronze serpent in the desert, which, according to a lot of people, refers to the knowledge of the Kundalini, the fire of the central sun that goes to the central channel that leads to enlightenment, to self-realization, to the activation of the light body that we talked about, the fifth kosha.
Exactly. The Kundalini.
The Kundalini, yeah, which is in my understanding not at all something that is accompanied by pain or suffering or all kinds of weird effects. It's something that's already there, that is, the Kundalini is always there, but to consciously use it in your spiritual practice, you can use it or through sexual transmutation, you can use it to gain access to these higher states of consciousness that
Exactly. Yeah. And the reason that people talk about Kundalini as being dangerous or painful is because they haven't been prepared enough. So in many of these ancient traditions, from the time you were very young, you're trained how to work with inner fears, inner conflicts, how to work with the physical body, the subtle body, doing certain meditations, practices, postures, mudras. So this became very easy to transition, where, okay, when it was the right time, the Kundalini would start moving up in different ways. So when you're young, it's not supposed to rise up all the way. You're working with the lower chakras, the development of the personality, development of your sense of physical presence on this earth.
Well, if you dive
nature.
into the tantric systems, there's even schools where there are no lower chakras, where the basic chakra, the most base chakra, starts in the heart, and there's only 5 going up. Other systems, for example, in India, the musicians had a chakra system based on their scale of tones, and they had 13 tones in their scale, and they had 13 chakras. They were working with the chakras and the tones and the frequencies of these chakras. So it's there's not even, people weren't even agreeing on how many there were. Like we're talking now, we have 7 chakras. The solar plexus is one of them, which also didn't exist in a lot of systems. I think even in Buddhism, they started with the heart chakra going up. I think it's interesting, and if you study the tantric texts, there's also no talking of spinning vortexes within the energy field. What they talk about is imagining a wheel with petals, and they place Sanskrit syllables in these petals, which are sounds that you produce. They're frequencies which create geometric patterns if you sing them or chant them or hum them. And it was a spiritual practice to meditate on these spinning wheels, so to say, to connect to these archetypal energies, these consciousnesses almost that work upon us and that work in us, which Jung called the demons or the aeons, the archons, as you talked about. And I think this is the work that when they talk about working with the Kundalini, it's about dealing with this animalistic nature, dealing with these instincts that are part of our animalistic nature, which is also part of the energy field. I think you talked earlier about the etheric body, which keeps the mineral body alive, basically, because the whole saying, ashes, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, basically our body is made out of the same, exactly the same components as the whole plant world. It's all minerals.
Right.
And then we have this animalistic nature that comes to us, which makes us move and hunt and want to eat and experience lust and jealousy and everything. And to transcend this is the work of the Kundalini. But you have to deal with these psychological issues that are somehow related to these locations where we think chakras are, where we experience anger and fear and lack of creativity.
So when you look at it in a holographic sense, the chakras are simply points of reference.
Yes.
So the etheric body is reflected in the outer world as the plant kingdom. The emotional body is represented in the outer world as the animal kingdom.
Yes.
The mental body is unique to humans and maybe to one or two other species. But this is like the next level of development. And then finally, when you get to the causal body, this is not even, early human. This is the next stage of humanity that we're developing into now. The next step for Gaia herself, where she's evolving a new human form or continues to evolve new human forms that are capable of being avatars on this earth. So that's the next, according to many of the Kashmir Shaivism, many other teachings, Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, this is something that is emerging now. The next human species is going to be a divine human species, Homo luminous, as the Incas termed this, or Homo universalis, as Barbara Marx Hubbard calls it. But this is the what the early Christians would have referred to perhaps as the return of the Christ, because this is not just a consciousness that's present in individuals anymore. It's a collective humanity that from, like the veils have been lifted from the entire species. So we're able to travel between worlds, we're able to live multidimensionally, we're able to transcend the limitations of time, space, matter, in ways that only a few people can experience today. So, but as a way shower, this was his job. And then, we could talk about the resurrection. You asked, was this something that, what was the resurrection? What actually happened then? So let's start with the Gnostic perspective. How do you see it from that tradition?
Well, like I said, for the Gnostics, they talk about, well, at least some teachings within the Gnostic tradition, because there's, of course, different viewpoints. But the Gnostics, they talk a lot about the symbolism that we see in the Bible. So going up to Mount Sinai, going up to a mountain, is basically making the inner journey and meeting God within on the top of the mountain. And getting the commandments is basically touching gnosis, or touching, in Sanskrit, I think it's jnana, like the jnanis, the wisdom that you get. And this is translated again or channeled by this person as commandments, or as this is how you deal with sin, or this is how you deal with our animalistic nature if you want to get rid of karma. So there's a lot of symbolism there. And I think the resurrection within Gnosticism, it's either seen as Christ went to Samadhi and he never actually died. And the other is that, well, Christ became this embodiment of the light body of the central sun. He embodied the fire, but then he fell back. He fell back to the earth, and he fell back in sin, and he had these 7 years of time where he had to reclimb this ladder of consciousness almost to get back to the place where he was. And it was even more difficult because we can't find back, and this is what they refer to as the falling of the angel. You can fall back into this. And how did he fall back into this? By having intercourse with Maria Magdalene, for example. So there's different theories within this concept. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say it's interesting that they in the Christian story that there's 3 days. He was buried for 3 days. Actually, it was just overnight, but they talk about these 3 days. And it's the same thing in the Egyptian tradition. When an initiate was placed in the sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid, it was for 3 days. So somehow that 3 days is part of the initiation that an initiate would go through. And I suppose this whole journey, there's 2 aspects to this. There's the external aspect where the drama is going on, the crucifixion and whatever the resurrection is about. And then there's the internal aspect, the initiation, the transmutation.
And what comes to mind is the shamanic ritual of the shamanic death, where you get reborn, where you resurrect basically as a shaman. And which could mean that the final rite of passage, in the sense of the final initiation of the Christ, was this initiation where he went through this equivalent of a shamanic death and came back reborn as a fully enlightened, fully embodied being of this Christ energy.
Right. Yeah, in the Aboriginal tradition, they literally talk about dismemberment. So it's like, okay, we're not obviously not talking about physical dismemberment, unless you're in a cannibalistic tribe. But
doesn't Kali rip you apart as well?
Yeah.
She rips you apart, and then
takes you apart, and then either you find yourself back together or not.
Yes.
But that's the training. So the reason that so much of the training it took a long time, it was so precise, was so you could find your way back. Maybe you're scattered across multiple dimensions, and then to find your way back and construct the light body in such a way that there's a unity of function, of purpose, of awareness, so you could be a bridge between these 5 bodies seamlessly. So in other words, you fall asleep, you're fully aware of every single place you go, each dream, each dimension. You're able to consciously meet anyone you want in your dream state. And to them, it's just as real as a waking state, because you've learned how to master the connection between these 5 bodies. So for an initiate, a Christed being, these connections, it took a long time. It took training, practice, and initiation such as this. So it's possible symbolically that this whole death resurrection myth, I'm saying myth in a larger context, was an initiation that allowed him to fully integrate himself at that time.
Yeah, and probably such a deep meditative state would look like death from somebody at it from the outside.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to the chronology. So in the Eastern tradition, this isn't where it ends. This is, in fact, just halfway through the story. Then he starts going off with many of his disciples, traveling to the east. Meanwhile, I think it would have been through Egypt, and then, or maybe through the Red Sea. Anyway, Mary Magdalene, or Mary of Magadha, went on up to France. And that's the Qatar tradition, which you're so familiar with living in the south of France. And that whole tradition then covered that southern Europe up into England, got persecuted, annihilated by the church because it was too threatening. Meanwhile, Issa and his other disciples, wandered back to Kashmir. And this was the beginning of a story that's not related in the West. It's not known in the West. I've been putting some pieces together from various sources and traditions, writings. And now there's even manuscripts in the Vatican, in the secret libraries of the Vatican, that go into this, because what happened is back then the church had access to all these manuscripts. Most of them were burnt because it was threatening, but there was a copy always taken to the Vatican Library. Initially Alexandria, and then eventually, once the church became more dominant, into the Vatican libraries. So there's even manuscripts in the Vatican now that corroborate all this. In fact, there's one book by Barry Long. If someone wants, I forget the title of it, I could look it up, which goes into an alternative Western version of Issa's story, which is fascinating. So anyway, so continuing on, so there's all kinds of accounts of what happened when he returned to Kashmir, his continued studies with Chaitanath, and what it meant to truly develop into an immortal. And at the end of his life, which he was married, he had children, 3 children. For a while, he was also the king of that valley in Kashmir, along with his wife Marjan, who is a Kashmiri woman. And both of them, and this is where it's there's a new tradition forming, where now there's man and woman holding equal position. So Issa and his wife Marjan had equal authority amongst the disciples there. Both of them eventually took the rainbow body. Both of them were students of Chaitanath. And my sense is that this was the beginning of the Kashmir Shaivism tradition as we know it today. So Abhinava Gupta and Shemaraj and all the others were inspired by this, because Shiva and Shakti were in balance in these traditions, rather than, in the earlier tradition in Advaita, Shiva was, the infinite, transcendental quality of God was highlighted, and the immanent feminine aspects were ignored. So here in Kashmir Shaivism, they both held together. And many say that they're still in body, both of them. Many actually have identified who they are, and this, if I speak those names, it would not be altogether unfamiliar to a lot of people. I'm not going to speak those names today. Maybe keep people guessing a bit. But it's interesting, it's like, what does it mean to be an immortal? What does it mean to take the rainbow body? And what does it mean that the same I am presence running through them is also available to each one of us as we unify? So the work is not about, it's not about the truth of who we are, which is that we are infinite consciousness, but creating the bridges to experience that in this current incarnation.
Let's talk about that a little bit, and explore that part. So tell us, what do you think about this part. I think it's fascinating. I think if you explain to us how Issa's master or his guru, his teacher, was an immortal, it's only logical that they would follow in these footsteps. And
Right. And the truth is, there's many, many immortals who are living out in the world today. Some of them out in their caves and mountains, some of them in the midst of ordinary life. Like someone like Saint Germain was living in the midst of ordinary people in the courts and um, traveling um, freely. Others would come, would show up, materialize, and then dematerialize. And there's endless stories, all through all the traditions of the world. Sometimes in shamanic cultures, people would experience these entities that they were known as spirit guides or inner teachers. Sometimes, but my sense is that as people became more and more adept in unifying their 5 bodies, the Maya koshas, that they could then start relating to these immortals in a very natural way that also incorporated the physical. So it wasn't just just going into dream states or meditative states or shamanic states, but it became part of your daily encounter with the world around you. You were a master. This was what a master meant. It was someone who was in mastery over these elements, within, without, above, below.
I think this is it, because it's one thing to have the realization that you are pure awareness without doing the spiritual work. These days, there's many, or at least some spiritual teachers within the non-dual community. To name a few, Francis Lucille and his student Rupert Spira, who talk about the direct path, where they basically go within and go directly to that part of us that is our true nature, that is our real self. But it doesn't mean that they have this mastership over the elements, like you said, or the ability to heal. I remember from my time when I was reading books from Sri Nisargadatta Maharaji, where people would ask him these questions, and he would be, why would I be concerned about these things? I am the absolute. I am all that. I am. And these things that you talk about are matters of the mind, are matters of this world that is merely appearing and disappearing inside of me and is never eternal. Yet, now if we speak about immortality, that's a different matter, because now, if you look at time or existence or creation from the perspective of immortality, which means eternity, then change in itself becomes a constant. And then these sayings like, I am the absolute, and these things come and go. Yes, but they come and go forever. So the balance changes. It shifts a bit. What is your opinion about this, or what do you think? How was Issa taught about this?
Yeah. So immortality, obviously, on a soul level, as a divine being, you don't even think about it. You are immortal. If you have the realization, if it's a realization that touches all the way down into the etheric body, it can be a very powerful, ecstatic, living experience of truth, of enlightenment, which can remain with you for the rest of your physical life. But the next step beyond that is to bring that realization into the cells of the physical body. And this is where Sri Aurobindo and the mother become so important, because their role as avatars and their vision for the next phase of humanity, for the next evolution of the human race, was that this unified consciousness, what they call the supramental force, could descend into the physical form as much as into the etheric, mental, emotional bodies. And this is something that's someone that there's much more room for this understanding in Kashmir Shaivism than
Yeah,
in
because I think the
the
way
Vedanta.
I understand this is, I think maybe I mentioned him last time. There's this Dutch philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, and he explains it nicely, because he says we have this meta mind, which he calls, or meta consciousness, which he says is basically God. It's basically our awareness, and every body that is separate from that is part of this meta mind or meta consciousness, but is dissociated from it. We experience dissociation from this mind that is all pervasive and all pervading. And it's almost like when you talk about Sri Aurobindo, when you talk about this descending of this awareness into the cells, into the body, it's almost like a dissolving of this dissociative state that our minds seem to be trapped in, which would mean that the self disappears. And this, in my experience or in my understanding, is in line with what I experience, because I have this saying, when you go to heaven, you have to leave your ego at the door, because realizing the true self means seeing that the personality is just a made-up thing. It's just a collection of memories. So immortality would mean, okay, you have this physical body, or maybe not. Maybe you manifest this physical body within awareness, which is a meta consciousness, a meta awareness, and you just have full control over it. But there's no personality. There's basically no one there. There's just this beingness that is there, but somehow it has a purpose. It must have a purpose.
It has a locus and it has an identity. So yes, so Issa was aware that he had an identity as a personal being, as a human form, with his set of memories and stories, interpretations from a cultural perspective, but he wasn't identified with that. And I think that would be the difference for me.
Yes.
So yeah, the personal self, you still, identified with it, as long as you're in the physical body, as long as you have a human personality. But your identity is not there. Your identity is the self, the one self. So when I say I am Kiara, what I'm saying, I'm holding equally I am and Kiara, divine and human, spirit and matter. So that statement, I am Kiara, is a very powerful statement if I'm really speaking it from knowledge, from awareness. Most of us don't. It's like, I'm identified with Kiara, so there's nothing beyond that. So I think the ultimate rainbow body initiation is when you're actually bringing the light body into the physical body, into the cells of the physical body. Sri Aurobindo talks about constructing the mind of light and then the body of light. And I think it was the same with Kashmir Shaivism. You created the mind of light, which was, working with infinite consciousness as it started to penetrate into the into the first set of lower bodies. And then the body of light was when it started to penetrate into the physical, cellular body with its own intelligence, with its own connection.
I remember a teaching of Swami Laxmanju where he talks about the Kundalini not being something that rises, but you have to bring the Kundalini down. And this is something that I've only seen so far in Kashmir Shaivism and also a little bit in Gnosticism, but they talk about it differently, where they talk about true liberation is only liberation if you can bring it back into creation, into this gross world as we experience it. Because if you escape this Maya or this illusion or this expression of Shakti and you become Shiva, but you can no longer go back into this expression of Shakti, where's the liberation in that?
Exactly.
Where's the freedom in that?
And there's no Shiva without Shakti. There's no Shakti without Shiva. Yeah. That's one thing in Kashmir Shaivism that I really appreciate. They talk about, you're familiar with the Tattva theory? There's the 36 Tattvas.
Yes.
That's one of the central aspects of Kashmir Shaivism. So the Tattvas are like aspects of the self. So, and so it's an experiential practice where you're experiencing your identity with each of these 36 tattvas. So it starts with Shiva Shakti. So I experience myself as Shiva, I experience myself as Shakti. I mean, those are very transcendental experiences. Then there's the three qualities of will, awareness, mental awareness, and action. So from the perspective of Icha Shakti, the will, I am aware of who I am. But, I'm aware that in the multiplicity of creation, there's a single unity, the self. Then the next aspect of that is where you can find yourself absorbed in the world, in the experiences of life, in everything you encounter in nature, in other people, or in yourself, the food you eat, the air you breathe, and you recognize all of that I am. So the first is I am that. The second is that I am. And then the third is where you experience that they're both in balance. I am that I am. So, when Moses said, I am that I am, it's like the combination, I am that I am. So it's very slight variations. So these are like the first 5 tattvas. Then you break through this veil of Maya. And in this tradition, it's not illusion. It's simply the filter through which transcendent or transcendental consciousness starts to penetrate into the world of creation, in the world of time and space. And so the creation of time and space is simultaneous with this penetration through the veil of Maya.
It's a movement almost.
It's a movement.
Yeah.
So, in the Advaita tradition, this is Narayana, this is Ishvara. So it's like the actual movement of penetrating into the world of dimensions, but then starting to forget. And the further down you go into the tattvas, the more forgetfulness there is. But
doesn't it remind you a bit of the falling?
Yeah.
The fallen angel, Lucifer, the light bearer who falls into this.
So what does the fall mean?
Greed and lust and everything.
Right. So when you bring awareness into that fallen nature, into those lower tattvas, so by the time you get to the lowest level, you're talking about the physical world.
Yeah.
Earth, water, air, fire, ether. So those are the 4 lowest. And then there's correlating aspects of cognition. So your senses, your five senses are related to the five elements. Your five organs of perception,
The
you know,
organs
your
of
nose,
perception,
your
yeah.
ears, your eyes, they're related to the five
Yeah, and they're not talking about the
qualities.
physical expression of the senses, but they're talking about hearing, seeing, uh,
Mm.
the expression of what we experience when we talk about the senses, right?
Right. And remember that in the human form as we know it, it's a very narrow, limited range
Yeah,
of expression. So a range of vision is from red to violet. A range of hearing is 20 to 20,000 hertz. Whereas if you look at the multiplicity of creation across dimensions, the entire spectrum is represented. So the organ of hearing then is not just hearing, you know, with the ears the way we do. It's the ability, it's that awareness of sound
yeah.
in all this multi-layered
And I think a
profoundness.
good way to look at this is when we dream, when we sleep and we dream, we hear, we smell, we see, we
Mm,
experience these, but we're not literally using our ears and eyes. We're
mm,
not aware of our physical body that is sleeping in the bed at that moment.
right.
You know?
So a blind man who's a woman um, can have very um, profound visions in dream state.
Yes,
You see everything as it is. Even if you're born blind, you'll still be able to dream in
exactly,
full color and full vision. How
exactly.
does that happen?
Yeah. And
So
I
it's not.
think as a good practice that I like to do as a within my sound healing practice
Mm,
is when you're listening to sound with headsets, and I made a meditation about this,
mm,
and you go to this inner space that is our awareness, and you have these headsets on, it's impossible to localize the sound in a specific location because of the absence of other senses. There's not a bird sitting on a tree that appears to be singing, so the sound is coming
mm,
from there.
mm,
But the sound actually appears within us without having a source that we can localize. And
right.
once you become aware of this, you can slowly pierce through these layers that we talked about, these sheets of perception, and climb up to this perception of being just this vast edgeless space
Mm,
that Shiva is, or that
yeah.
they talk about in
One
Buddhism.
aspect of the Kashmir Shaivism is the doctrine of vibration, Spanda. So that's
That's
your
why,
art of Spanda.
that's why
And
my business is called Out of
mm,
Spanda. Yeah.
yeah.
And this is might and you might have something to say about this as well, because in Kashmir Shaivism, um, I remember the first book that I read from Swami Lakshmanju. He talks about the Sanskrit alphabet and the
Mm,
sounds of the Sanskrit,
mm,
and they say it's all started with the sounds. It all started with vibration,
mm,
and then you read the Bible, and it says first there was the word.
mm,
eh?
right.
And there you
And
again you see, wait a minute, what's going on here? You know, why is there this connection here? They speak about sound in Kashmir Shaivism, they speak about the word in Christianity or in the Gospels. There's something going on. There's a link. They talk about the same thing.
and when you develop a certain level of mastery, then you become a creator consciously using sound, using intention. So you say something and it manifests. So Jesus could perform a healing by saying, you know, you're healed or awake from the dead or whatever it was. You know, that quality of intention expressed through sound was highly creative.
Yeah, and it's highly complex as well because I mean we now know um, through a technology which is called cymatics, where we
Mm,
can project a sound in a petri dish, for example, with a fluid in it. And by creating waves, standing waves, and putting light on it, we can see these geometric patterns appear within the fluid. And I think a lot of people have seen the same principle with a steel plate with sand on it, for example, and you move sound vibration through this plate, and you see that these geometrical patterns, these mandalas, they appear. And in some ancient Indian temples, you have these complex geometric figures, these mandalas, sculpted on the roof. And I think there is a profound secret here, because everything is geometry. If everything is sound, everything is geometry. And maybe some people listening to this have read the books of Drunvalo Melchizedek, the sacred geometry, or other people who've studied the sacred geometry. Is that I think if we can somehow tap into the secret of these sounds, and we can transform these geometries back into sound, because now we can transform sound into geometries. If somebody chants Om, we see the Shri Yantra. The Shri Yantra symbol is literally what you see if you chant an Om, and you can actually do this with a cymatics device. You can create the Shri Yantra symbol by chanting the Om sounds. So what if we can transform these geometric figures back into sound? We can realize that we can shape reality through these geometric patterns using sounds, and the other way around.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's going on right now with the crop circles. So I've visited many of them across the years in England and elsewhere, and many people have actually seen these crop circles being formed. It takes a few seconds, and what happens is they hear a tone, and there's lights which then create these instantly, these very complex designs, geometrical structures in the crop fields. The crop actually bends in a way that you can actually measure radiation in a, when you have a device. So there's something going on there that's not ordinary. Now, what if you could, like you say, go back? So if a certain geometry was tied in with an intention, maybe there's a design, a planetary design that's coded as a certain geometry. It appears in the fields. It carries a vibration, which, even though you don't hear it, when you're in the presence of these fields, or even looking at it on a screen, you're being affected. Something in you is responding subconsciously and superconsciously. It's affecting your vibrational structures. It's affecting your cells, the DNA. And if this is part of how Gaia is evolving, you can see the correspondences, the way sacred geometry and cymatics and superconscious awakening and creation actually works. And this is so in the story of the tattvas. If you bring your awareness step by step through all 36 of these tattvas and recognize, I am this, I am this, I am this. And then there's like you're building this unification within your personal, collective, universal field. Because if you are Shiva, Shakti, and you are all 5 of these elements, and the organs of perception, the organs of creation, you have all the intermediate layers. It's like it's a training in co-creation. You become a master, you become someone who knows how to create new worlds.
Yes.
Uh,
Up to a
yeah.
level where they talk about the last step is
Mm,
the grace of Shiva.
yeah. So grace is and grace is built into the whole system.
Yes.
Nothing exists without grace. It's not like you're waiting for a moment of grace.
Yeah.
Grace is part of each moment because nothing is outside of the Divine Mother. The Divine Mother is grace. It's just another name for this quality of expression that moves through all things, that has power, that has vision, that has intelligence, and that has an evolutionary purpose. And it's all part of who we are. So this is, I mean, if we really get to the heart of Kashmir Shaivism and we get to the heart of Issa's teachings,
I want to say to the heart of Gnosticism, to the heart of true Christianity, Christianity.
right, right. What is it? I mean, that's I am. I am God. You know, the qualities of God, omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience, uh, unlimitedness, ability to stretch and understand things as necessary in all dimensions of form. So whether I'm in physical body or whether I'm in some other dimensional existence, or whether I'm completely transcendental, experiencing myself as infinite consciousness beyond time and space, I can go back and forth. I can create bridges. I can
Yes,
enter
Swami
into the
Lakshmanju
process of
used to
creation.
say when people asked, so why did God do this? Why did God create all
Mm.
this? Why was Shakti an expression of Shiva pouring himself out into this creative potentiality, this principle? And Swami used to say, play, to play. We're
Yeah,
here to play.
yeah.
That's all what it's about. Play.
Leela, right.
Mm,
Play of consciousness. Yeah, that's the title of one of Muktananda's books, Swami Muktananda, Play of Consciousness.
the play of consciousness.
Yeah, and it's like we are in training to become divine creators. Yeah, it's a long training, and it's not always easy. It starts with self-realization in the sense that you recognize who you are, and then the next step, which is the big step, is the embodiment of who you are. So it's not just a mental jnana recognition; it's on the level of kriya. You're actually
Yes.
manifesting it in daily life. Everything you do, every place you go, everyone you encounter, you're you're affecting that field through your own um, ability to bridge between the worlds.
Yes, and I think this is where I encounter problems with new Advaita, for example, the new
Mm,
Advaita Vedanta, where somebody has this self-realization, somebody finds the gateless gate, so to say, and the ego burns, and he sits down on the ashes and says, "There is no gate." While there actually is a whole path behind the gate.
mm, yeah.
And by sitting on the corpse of your ego, telling everybody that there is no path, um, people get stuck into this intellectual experience of non-beingness almost, and
Mm,
they miss the play part
mm.
where, and also the suffering in a sense, because
Yeah, and it becomes very frustrating. It's like, you talk about enlightenment, show me the path, and there's nothing to show you. It's like, yep, grace is all about grace. So you wait for grace. And then it's just the separation between knowledge and awareness and present experience.
yeah,
And it's not, you know, that's why I like Kashmir Shaivism because it's an embodied path. You talk about Kundalini moving up, you also talk about Kundalini moving down.
exactly.
Um, Spirit and matter come into unity. So the body becomes sacred, the world becomes sacred, everything becomes sacred, not just when you leave and go into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but here, Sahat Samadhi, manifesting and exploring creation, with all your senses, with your intention to be part of this wholeness and create wholeness wherever you go.
Fully aware, fully conscious, and with an open heart.
Yeah, exactly. So going back a little bit to Kashmir Shaivism, you talked about the Spanda, this doctrine of vibration. There's another
pulse.
Yeah, the Om, the word. So in Kashmir Shaivism and many of the Himalayan traditions, there's the meditation on the sound current.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that could benefit a lot of people. You're just listening for a tone, and you might hear it closer to the left ear, the right ear, or maybe in the center of the head. You start with what's there. It may be a buzzing, it may be a tingling, it may be a sound like a bell, the sound of the ocean running through a conch shell, whatever it may be. You start with that, or if you don't hear it, just cover your ears and you'll hear something very distinct. And then you start with that, you follow that, you follow that, you follow that. You go to the most subtle sounds that you can hear. And eventually, it's like you're just tracing your way back to the original sound, to primordial sound. And so in the process of just listening to that sound current, you're creating a bridge. And if you're doing that as a meditation, even if it's just 10 minutes a day, and if that's the only meditation you ever do, it's still a lot, because you start
like
building
following
these
the
bridges.
river upstream.
Yeah, back to source.
Yeah.
Where does it originate? Yeah. So it does take a bit of work because you're paddling upstream. It would be easier just to let go and kind of, flow. So all meditation, there's a passive aspect and there's a active creative aspect. So the sound current is very active because it's a very direct and intensive focus on this sound. And you just follow that sound. It changes from time to time. You just listen for the highest vibration, the highest frequency. Keep following it, keep following it. Eventually it's like you enter into, bridging of the five bodies. You enter into this infinite consciousness, but it's also embodied, it's also cellular, because you're listening within the body. Then you experience that the cells in the body are the stars in the galaxy. They become galaxies in the universe. Everything is interconnected. Everything is holographic. And you are that. So whether you're focusing on that transcendentally or that in each microcosm of an atom within your cells, there's no inside and outside anymore.
It's the same thing. Yeah.
It's the same thing. Yeah. And at that point, what's the difference between you as a human creator and that as a divine prime creator? There isn't. Because it's all fractal and holographic in nature, and it's not past and present and future. It's all here and now.
Yeah.
So that's what it means to truly experience yourself as God, which is meant to be a normal human experience. And I think that's really the essence of what Issa and Marjan were teaching.
I think it is. And I think this is where you touch when he said, and then we're back at the beginning, is only through me. And he was referring to this expanded sense of non-self that is the nature of all of us.
So no one can get to the Father except through me. You could say except through I am.
Yeah.
Because that's that essence, the spaciousness of being.
Yeah. And by following that primordial hum, I call it, or the Om, Om, Amen, is basically following the song of the Father. It is through the Father that you reach at the source. And when you realize that the source and the stream are made of the same thing, it
Yeah,
was there all along, you know?
yeah. And you're not creating a split between father and mother. So Shiva and Shakti, they're the first two tattvas. I am Shiva, I am Shakti, and then all the way down those 36 levels, identifying with each one of them, and then experiencing the unity as one consciousness flowing through all of them. And that's how you experience and express your creatorship.
Beautiful. And this is all explained in your book?
Yeah, a lot of it. I mean, I wrote the book. It's called Issa, Son of the Sun. So, Son of the Sun. But then it felt like this is the first in a trilogy. So I think so this was more from the perspective of, I'm writing the book as a novel. So it's more easily assimilated.
Yeah.
But the first book is from the perspective of Marjan, his Kashmiri wife. Second book, I think, will be from the perspective of both of them as equals. That's the Shiva Shakti, the tradition of Kashmir Shaivism as both being equally important. And then the third of the trilogy will be on taking the rainbow body. So that's like, okay. And I think a lot of that, there's some literature out there, source material, but a lot of it has to be an inner exploration at this point. So I'm realizing that by the time I get to the third book, it will be part of my own journey of mastery.
Wonderful.
So I don't know how many years that takes, but
well, a book can be a long process, but can also be very fast. Huh?
Yeah. And I think that's the journey today. It's like the beauty of this time is that everything is being magnified and accelerated so much.
Yes.
So I think we are making this transition, and the transition takes time. And the first stages of this is very difficult and rough because we're pioneering something altogether new. But once we start penetrating through the veils, then things happen quicker and quicker. And
it's almost like the world has become a stage for this huge initiation where people are getting scattered, like the body that was scattered and have to be put together. But now as a collective, we're going through this, and maybe as a collective, we can transcend together to this rainbow society, so to say.
The rainbow warriors,
The rainbow warriors,
people,
yeah.
the rainbow tribes. Yeah, the rainbow bridge.
Exactly. Well, wonderful. Shall we end with this?
That sounds good. It's a beautiful way to end.
Yeah.
So look for rainbows inside you, outside you, everywhere you go.
Yeah. Rainbows everywhere.
Rainbows. Kermit the Frog, why are there so many songs about rainbows? Rainbows have nothing to hide. And then it goes on.
Well,
so, yeah.
I
So
really
this has
enjoyed
been
talking to you
wonderful.
again.
Yeah. So thank you, and more to come.
Yes. Thank you. Bye, Kiara.
Blessings. Bye. Bye, Ingmar.